Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Biographer. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend part of your evening here with me. Tonight we're not simply revisiting history. We're drifting gently through the remarkable life of a man whose journey carried him from a humble log cabin with a dirt floor to the highest office in the land. A man who rose from poverty and obscurity to become the 16th President of the United States, a leader who guided his nation through its darkest and most uncertain days, who helped end the institution of slavery, and whose words continue to echo through history with quiet strength, wisdom, and grace. For now, though, there's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to accomplish. Let your shoulders relax, your breathing slow, and the weight of the day begin to fade. Abraham Lincoln was many things: a storyteller, a wrestler, a surveyor, a lawyer, and a dreamer. He carried deep sorrow throughout much of his life, yet he never lost his gift for humor or his ability to bring comfort to others through a well-told story. He taught himself through endless reading, often by the light of a fireplace, and developed a belief that would ultimately change the course of history, that all people deserved the opportunity to live free. Along the way tonight, you may discover details you've never heard before. You may find yourself imagining another time, another world. But most of all, I hope this story helps you unwind, relax, and drift peacefully towards sleep, carried along by the steady rhythm of a life devoted to purpose, perseverance, and unity. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a single-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, about 3 miles south of the town of Hodgenville. The cabin had a dirt floor, one window, and measured perhaps 16 by 18 feet. It sat on Sinking Spring Farm, named for a natural spring that still flows today, cold and clear from the limestone bedrock. His parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, had married just 3 years earlier, and Abraham was their second child. His sister Sarah had been born 2 years before, and there would be one more child, a brother named Thomas, who died in infancy. Thomas Lincoln was a carpenter and farmer, descended from weavers who had come from England to Massachusetts in 1637. He was a sturdy man who worked with his hands, skilled at building cabins and making furniture. But he was not a wealthy man, and he struggled with land titles in Kentucky, where overlapping claims and unclear boundaries meant that a farmer could lose everything he'd worked for through no fault of his own. Nancy Hanks. Lincoln was a quiet, deeply religious woman from a Baptist tradition that forbade dancing, drinking, and slavery. She could read, but probably could not write. Those who knew her said she had a gentle spirit and a keen mind, and that young Abraham inherited his thoughtfulness from her. She sang hymns as she worked, and she told her children Bible stories by the fireplace at night. As you breathe in now, imagine the smell of wood smoke, the flicker of firelight on log walls, the sound of wind through the Kentucky hills, a family gathered close against the winter cold, a mother's voice rising soft in the darkness. When Abraham was 2 years old, the family moved to a larger farm on Knob Creek, still in Hardin County, but in a valley where the soil was better for farming. The Louisville-Nashville Turnpike ran near their cabin, and young Abraham would have watched the traffic pass by. Soldiers marching to distant battlefields during the War of 1812, merchants with their wagons, and slave coffles, chained men and women being driven south to be sold. This was Abraham's first glimpse of slavery, and though he was only a child, he never forgot it. His earliest memories were of this place. He remembered planting pumpkin seeds with his father in the spring, only to watch a flash flood wash them all away. He remembered the Knob Creek itself, where he nearly drowned once, saved by a friend who pulled him from the water. He remembered the rolling hills covered in trees, the taste of wild berries, and the endless work of frontier farming. Life was hard. Abraham and Sarah attended what was called a blab school, where students recited their lessons aloud in a chorus. He learned his ABCs, learned to read simple words. But his total formal schooling in Kentucky amounted to only a few weeks. His father needed him in the fields, and education was a luxury frontier families could rarely afford. As the night grows quiet, let yourself rest in that same spirit of hunger for knowledge, of making do with what you have, of learning in whatever way you can. In December 1816, when Abraham was 7 years old, Thomas Lincoln decided to move the family to Indiana. There were several reasons. The land title problems in Kentucky had become unbearable. Thomas had lost multiple claims and hundreds of acres to legal disputes. And Indiana, which had just become a state that year, had outlawed slavery in its constitution. Thomas Lincoln, a religious man who opposed slavery, wanted to raise his family in free territory. The journey from Kentucky to Indiana was about 100 miles through unbroken forest. They crossed the Ohio River, then traveled north into Spencer County, where Thomas had claimed land near Little Pigeon Creek. It was December, cold and harsh, and when they arrived, there was no cabin, no shelter, only wilderness. Thomas quickly built what was called a half-faced camp. 3 walls of logs and boughs with one side open to the elements, a fire burning constantly to keep the family warm. They lived like this through that first winter, huddled behind the flames, while bears prowled in the darkness, and the wind cut through the thin shelter. Abraham would later recall the panther's scream, and bears that preyed on the swine, painting a picture of a wild, dangerous frontier where survival was never certain. As you drift now, imagine that firelight, the vast dark forest pressing close, the warmth of family against the cold, the courage it took to start again in a new place. By spring, Thomas had built a proper cabin, still just 1 room, but more substantial, and they began to clear land for farming. Abraham, though only 8 years old, was given an axe, and from that moment on, he would spend much of his youth cutting trees, splitting rails, and breaking the hard earth. He grew tall and strong, with muscles like iron from the constant labor. But he never learned to love farming. He hated hunting too, which was unusual for a frontier boy. Once, when he was 8, he shot and killed a wild turkey through a crack in the cabin wall, and he felt such remorse that he never pulled a trigger at game again. He much preferred reading to hunting, learning to working in the fields. His stepmother would later say that Abraham would go to any length to avoid manual labor if there was a book to be read instead. This wasn't laziness. It was a profound hunger to understand the world beyond the forest, to know things that couldn't be learned by swinging an axe. In October 1818, 2 years after they arrived in Indiana, tragedy struck. Nancy Lincoln fell ill with what was called milk sickness, a mysterious disease that settlers didn't understand. We know now that it was caused by cows eating white snake root, a poisonous plant, and passing the toxin through their milk. Nancy grew weaker and weaker, and on October 5, 1818, she died. She was only 34 years old. Abraham was 9. Sarah was 11. Their cousin Dennis Hanks, who lived with them, was 19. Thomas Lincoln was left alone with 3 children and no one to help run the household. They buried Nancy in the forest on a hill near the cabin, in a simple grave marked only with wooden pegs. Abraham, still just a boy, helped his father make the coffin. The winter that followed was the bleakest of Abraham's childhood, without their mother. The cabin became cold in more than temperature. Sarah tried her best to cook and clean, but she was just a child herself. The family wore the same clothes day after day. They ate the same simple foods. The cabin floor remained unswept. As the world around you softens, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even in the deepest grief, life continues. That even in the darkest winter, spring eventually comes. About a year after Nancy's death, Thomas Lincoln traveled back to Kentucky. He had known a woman there named Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. Thomas proposed to her at once, and she agreed. Soon Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln arrived in Indiana with her 3 children, household goods, and a determination to make a proper home. She was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, brought furniture and dishes, sewed new clothes for all the children, and treated Abraham and Sarah with the same love and care as her own. She saw something special in young Abraham, saw his hunger for learning, his melancholy nature, his quick mind, and she encouraged him in ways his father never could. Abraham would later call her his angel mother, and he loved her deeply for the rest of his life. She brought books, not many, perhaps half a dozen in all, but to Abraham, they were treasures beyond price. He read them over and over, the Bible, of course, which he could eventually recite long passages from memory, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, a biography of George Washington, and lessons in elocution, which taught him how to speak publicly. He read by firelight. He read by candlelight. He borrowed books from neighbors and walked miles to return them. He copied passages onto boards with charcoal when he had no paper. People who knew him as a boy remembered him always with a book. They remembered how he would read aloud, pacing back and forth, gesturing dramatically, memorizing speeches and poetry. They remembered how he could make them laugh with stories, how he could make them think with questions, how different he was from the other frontier children who cared only about hunting and farming. His total formal education in Indiana was perhaps 12 months, spread across several years with different traveling teachers. He learned his sums, practiced his penmanship, memorized his multiplication tables. But his real education came from reading, from listening to adults talk, from asking questions, from thinking deeply about everything he encountered. One of his teachers remembered Lincoln as unusual, always asking why, never satisfied with just memorizing facts. Another teacher taught him manners and how to compose letters. From him, Lincoln learned the formal language of correspondence that would serve him well in later years. He practiced writing letters to imaginary people, creating elaborate scenarios just to master the form. His stepmother Sarah brought not just books, but a love of stories. She would tell the children tales from the Bible, stories of heroes and villains, of trials and triumphs. Abraham absorbed these narratives, recognized their power, and began to understand how stories could teach lessons and move people's hearts. All his life, he would be a storyteller, using parables and anecdotes to make his points, to diffuse tension, to illuminate truth. As you breathe slowly now, let yourself rest in that same love of learning. Let the need to rush fade away. Let knowledge come gently, naturally, like water seeping into thirsty ground. Abraham grew tall, eventually reaching 6 feet 4 inches, which was extraordinary for his time. He was lanky and awkward, with long arms and big hands, dark hair that never lay flat, and a face that people said was homely, but somehow unforgettable. His eyes were grey and deeply set, often appearing sad, even when he smiled. He had a high, thin voice that seemed odd coming from such a large man, but when he spoke, people listened. His physical strength was legendary. He could hold an axe by the handle at arm's length and keep it perfectly horizontal. He could lift a box weighing 400 pounds. In wrestling matches, a popular frontier sport, he was almost unbeatable, using his long reach and strength to his advantage. But he rarely used his strength for violence. He was known for his patience and his good humor. His moral courage matched his physical strength. He loved to tell stories and jokes. He would gather people around him and make them roar with laughter, mimicking voices, exaggerating for effect, building to a punchline with perfect timing. Often his stories were a bit crude. Frontier humor was not refined, but they were always clever. And he used them not just for entertainment, but to make points, to teach lessons, to diffuse tension. All his life, he would use humor as both shield and sword. His humor sometimes masked deep pain. He would joke about his appearance, calling himself ugly before anyone else could. He would tell funny stories when he was feeling most melancholy, as if laughter could hold darkness at bay. And he was remarkably empathetic and kind. He couldn't bear to see animals suffer. Cruelty, whether to animals or people, was foreign to his nature. When Abraham was 19, he got his first opportunity to see beyond Indiana. A neighbor hired him to help take a flatboat loaded with farm products down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. For young Abraham, it was an adventure beyond imagining. He and his companion built the flatboat themselves, loaded it with pork, corn, and flour, and then floated 1,200 miles downriver, navigating rapids, avoiding snags, and fighting off bandits who tried to raid their cargo one night near Baton Rouge. The two men fought them off with clubs, suffering bruises and cuts, but managing to escape downriver. New Orleans was the largest city Abraham had ever seen. It had broad streets, fine houses, theaters, and markets selling goods from around the world. It also had slave markets, where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. Abraham walked through those markets and saw men and women standing on auction blocks, saw families torn apart, saw children sold away from their mothers. He saw the shackles, heard the auctioneer's voice, witnessed the casual cruelty of a system that treated people as property. He never forgot what he saw. Years later, he would tell a friend, "I saw something in New Orleans that sickened me. I said to myself then, if I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I'll hit it hard." He kept that vow. As the night settles over you, let yourself feel the weight of that young man's conscience. the burden of witnessing injustice and carrying it with him, waiting for the day when he might have the power to make things right. Before his river journey, Abraham had suffered another devastating loss. His sister Sarah, who had married, died in childbirth at age 20. She was Abraham's only sibling, his closest companion through their mother's death and the hard years that followed. Her loss deepened the melancholy that had been growing in him since childhood, that shadow that would follow him all his life. There was a darkness in Abraham Lincoln, a deep sadness that people who knew him always remarked upon. He would fall into what he called his hypo, short for hypochondria, but meaning more like depression. His face would grow even more gaunt and sad. He would withdraw from company. He would speak of death, of the meaninglessness of life, of the dark void waiting for all people. But he also had a tremendous will to live, to achieve, to leave some mark on the world. And he had his humor, which could pull him back from the edge of despair. And he had his ambition, burning bright even in the darkest moments, driving him forward when sadness might have kept him still. In March 1830, when Abraham was 21, the whole Lincoln family moved again to Illinois. Abraham helped his father build yet another cabin, split more rails for fences, broke more land for planting, and then, at 21, he was legally free to leave his father's household and strike out on his own. He moved to the village of New Salem, Illinois, a tiny settlement on the Sangamon River with perhaps 100 residents. He arrived with almost nothing, no money, no property, no formal education beyond the bare basics. But he had intelligence, ambition, and a talent for winning people over with his honesty and humor. New Salem would be his home for the next 6 years, and it was there that he would transform himself from a frontier laborer into a man of law and politics. As you drift now, imagine that moment of choice, that decision to leave behind everything familiar and step into an uncertain future. Feel the courage that takes, the faith in yourself when you have nothing else to rely on. In New Salem, Lincoln took whatever work he could find. He clerked in a store. He split rails. He worked as a surveyor, learning mathematics and using instruments to map out property lines. He served as postmaster, which gave him the happy opportunity to read every newspaper that came through the mail. He studied grammar from a book, determined to speak correctly. He read Shakespeare and Robert Burns, memorizing their rhythms and cadences. And he began to study law. He borrowed law books from a lawyer in Springfield and taught himself by reading them again and again, thinking through cases, memorizing statutes. He had no teacher, no formal training, just determination and an iron will to improve himself. People would see him walking down the road, book in hand, lips moving as he memorized, completely lost in thought. In 1832, at age 23, he ran for the Illinois state legislature, but finished 8th out of 13 candidates. His campaign had been interrupted when the Black Hawk War broke out and he volunteered for the militia, serving for 3 months but seeing no combat. He would later joke that his only battles were against mosquitoes. The following year, he went into business with a partner, buying a general store. But his partner drank heavily and the business failed, leaving Lincoln with debts he called the national debt because they were so large. It took him nearly 15 years to pay them off, but he insisted on paying every penny. His reputation for honesty, already strong, became ironclad. People started calling him Honest Abe, a nickname he didn't especially like, but couldn't shake. In 1834, he ran for the legislature again, and this time, he won. He was 25 years old. He served in the Illinois House of Representatives for 4 terms, 8 years, establishing himself as a skilled debater, a careful thinker, and a principled but practical politician. He was a Whig, supporting internal improvements like roads and canals, supporting education, and quietly, cautiously, opposing slavery. In 1837, he and one other legislator issued a protest stating that slavery was founded on both injustice and bad policy. During these years in New Salem, Lincoln also fell in love for the first time with a young woman named Ann Rutledge. She was 22, pretty and kind, and Lincoln was utterly smitten. But in the summer of 1835, Anne fell ill with typhoid fever, and on August 25, 1835, she passed away. Anne's death devastated him. Lincoln's grief was so profound that friends feared for his sanity. He spoke of suicide. He wandered the woods alone. A couple named Bowling and Nancy Green took him into their home and cared for him for weeks. Slowly, he recovered, but something in him was changed. His melancholy grew deeper. The darkness was always there now, a companion he could never quite shake. For the rest of his life, he would visit Anne's grave when he passed through that part of Illinois, standing there in silence, lost in memory and sorrow. As the world around you fades, let yourself rest in the knowledge that grief is part of love, that sorrow is the price we pay for caring deeply, that we carry our losses with us always, but they need not define us. In 1837, at age 28, Lincoln moved to Springfield, the state capital, to practice law. He shared a room above a store with Joshua Speed, a merchant who became his closest friend. The two men talked late into the night about politics, philosophy, women, and life. Speed was one of the few people with whom Lincoln could be completely honest about his struggles with depression, his fears and doubts, his loneliness. Lincoln began to make a name for himself as a lawyer. He rode the circuit, traveling from county to county following the judge, trying cases in rough courtrooms before juries of farmers and townspeople. He was not a brilliant legal scholar, but he was persuasive with juries, because he spoke plainly, told stories they could relate to, and had an uncanny ability to see the heart of a case. Riding the circuit meant spending weeks away from home, traveling on horseback or in a buggy from courthouse to courthouse across central Illinois. The lawyers and judge would travel together, staying in primitive taverns and boarding houses, sharing rooms and meals. At night, they would gather around the fire, telling stories, arguing cases, and engaging in the rough camaraderie of frontier legal practice. Lincoln loved circuit life. He was free from domestic responsibilities, could focus entirely on his work, and was the best storyteller of the group. He also had a reputation for honesty that bordered on the excessive. Once, when he realized he had accidentally charged a client too much, he walked several miles to return the overpayment. Another time, he refused to take a case because he believed his potential client was in the wrong, even though the case would have been lucrative. He believed in justice, not just in winning. One famous case involved a widow whose son had been killed in the Mexican-American War. She was entitled to a pension, but a pension agent had taken half of it as his fee. The widow came to Lincoln, who was outraged. He sued the agent and won the full amount back for her. When she asked what she owed him, Lincoln said, "Nothing. I have done nothing but what I ought to have done." He formed a partnership with William Herndon, a younger lawyer who would later write one of the most important early biographies of Lincoln. Their office was on the second floor of a building on the town square in Springfield. 2 rooms, a few chairs, a table, some bookshelves, and not much else. Lincoln would greet clients himself, often sitting on the floor to talk with children while their parents discussed legal matters. His handwriting was clear and distinctive, economical with words, but precise in meaning. As you drift now, let yourself rest in that image of patient work, of building a career through integrity and effort, of finding meaning in service to others. In 1839, Lincoln met Mary Todd at a dance in Springfield. She was 21, from a wealthy Kentucky family, well-educated, witty, and intensely interested in politics. Lincoln was 30, poor, awkward, and still grieving. On the surface, they seemed mismatched. Her family certainly thought so. Her sister and brother-in-law actively discouraged the relationship, considering Lincoln beneath her station. But Mary saw something in him that others missed. She saw his ambition, his intelligence, his potential for greatness. She told friends that he would one day be president, a prediction that seemed absurd at the time. And Lincoln, for his part, was drawn to her quick mind and her political instincts. Their courtship was complicated. Mary was vivacious and social, loving parties and the attention of admirers. Lincoln was awkward and melancholy, uncomfortable with the rituals of courtship. Lincoln himself was plagued by doubts. Was he good enough for her? Could he make her happy? On New Year's Day, 1841, he broke off the engagement. He fell into such a deep depression that he could barely function. He missed votes in the legislature. He wrote to a friend that he was the most miserable man living and contemplated suicide. Over the next year and a half, friends worked to reconcile the couple. Lincoln and Mary began seeing each other again, cautiously at first, gradually rebuilding their connection. They discovered that despite their differences, they understood each other. Both had lost their mothers young. Both loved politics and literature. Both had tempers and strong opinions. Both were ambitious for more than ordinary lives. On November 4th, 1842, somewhat suddenly, they were married at her sister's home in Springfield. Lincoln was so nervous that when asked if he took Mary as his wife, he reportedly said, "With this ring I thee wed, and I hope with all my heart and soul," as if already anticipating the difficulties ahead. Their marriage was, by most accounts, tumultuous. Mary had a fierce temper and could be demanding and difficult. She spent money they didn't have. She was jealous of Lincoln's attention, but she also supported his ambitions fiercely, managed their household, raised their children, and gave him the social refinement he lacked. She entertained political allies, cultivated important relationships, and gave Lincoln advice on strategy. When he was depressed, she would encourage him. When he was uncertain, she would push him forward. She believed in his destiny, perhaps more than he believed in it himself. Lincoln rarely responded to her outbursts with anger. He would simply leave the house, walk around the block, and return when she had calmed down. He called her mother, and seemed to accept her temperament as part of who she was. As the world around you fades, let yourself rest in the complexity of human relationships. The way love can be both difficult and essential. The way we choose to be with people not because they're perfect, but because we cannot imagine life without them. They had 4 sons, Robert Todd Lincoln, born in 1843, was the only one who lived to adulthood. Edward Baker Lincoln, born in 1846, died of tuberculosis in 1850, at age 4. William Wallace Lincoln, born in 1850, died of typhoid fever in 1862, at age 11. Thomas, nicknamed Tad, born in 1853, died in 1871, at age 18. 3 of Lincoln's 4 children died young. The weight of that grief, added to all his other sorrows, was almost unbearable. Willie was brilliant and charming, Lincoln's favorite. He loved to read and write, showed unusual intelligence for his age, and had his father's gift for empathy. He was kind to everyone, treating all with equal respect. Lincoln would play with Willie and Tad in the evenings, wrestling with them on the floor, letting them climb on him like a jungle gym, delighting in their laughter. Tad was born with a cleft palate and speech impediment. He was hyperactive and impulsive, and Lincoln doted on him. Perhaps because after losing 2 sons, he couldn't bear to be stern with those who remained. As you breathe in and out, let yourself rest in the bitter sweetness of family life. The joy mingled with inevitable loss, the way love makes us vulnerable, but also makes life worth living. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, his first and only term in Congress. He and Mary moved to Washington, D.C. with their 2 young sons. Lincoln opposed the Mexican-American War, calling it an unjust act of aggression by President James K. Polk. His stance was unpopular in Illinois, and he returned to Springfield in 1849, convinced his political career was over. For the next 5 years, Lincoln focused on his law practice. He became one of the most respected lawyers in the state. He argued a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. He bought a house for his family on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield. But politics kept calling him back. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This overturned the Missouri Compromise, which had maintained a balance between slave and free states for 30 years. Lincoln, who had been relatively quiet on slavery, was outraged. He began speaking publicly against the expansion of slavery, carefully crafting arguments that were both moral and constitutional. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the brainchild of Senator Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's longtime Illinois rival. Douglas believed in popular sovereignty, letting settlers in each territory vote on whether to allow slavery. Instead of diffusing tensions, his act led to violence in Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed to the territory to influence the vote. Bleeding Kansas became a preview of the Civil War. Lincoln began speaking against the Kansas-Nebraska Act throughout Illinois. His speeches were carefully constructed, building arguments step by step. He would quote the Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal, arguing that this included Black Americans. He would acknowledge that many whites opposed social equality with blacks, but he insisted that opposition to slavery did not require belief in social equality. It merely required recognizing that slavery was wrong. He said slavery was wrong, a violation of the Declaration of Independence's promise. But he also said the federal government had no power to abolish slavery where it already existed in the southern states. The best that could be done was to prevent its spread into new territories, to put it on a path to ultimate extinction. His speeches lasted hours. Frontier audiences had long attention spans. and people came from miles around to hear him. His House-divided speech in Springfield on June 16, 1858, accepting the Republican nomination for Senate, was his most provocative. He declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other." In 1858, the Illinois Republican Party nominated Lincoln to run for U.S. Senate against Stephen A. Douglas. The campaign centered on a series of 7 debates held in towns across Illinois. Tens of thousands of people came to watch Lincoln and Douglas argue about slavery, states' rights, and the future of the nation. The debates were reprinted in newspapers across the country, making Lincoln a national figure. The 7 debates were held in Ottawa, Freeport, Jonesboro, Charleston, Galesburg, Quincy, and Alton. Each followed the same format. One candidate spoke for an hour, the other replied for an hour and a half, and the first candidate had a half-hour rebuttal. Audiences stood for 3 hours, in heat, cold, and rain, to hear these debates. They came by train, by wagon, on horseback, and on foot. The physical contrast between the 2 men was striking. Douglas was short and powerfully built, with a large head, booming voice, and commanding presence. People called him the Little Giant. Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall, gaunt, with a high-pitched voice and awkward movements. Yet when he spoke, his logic, his moral clarity, and his eloquence made people forget his appearance. Douglas argued for popular sovereignty and accused Lincoln of being an abolitionist who favored racial equality. Lincoln carefully rebutted both charges. He said he opposed the spread of slavery, but respected the right of Southern states to maintain it where it existed. He was always aware of political realities, of how far he could push without losing support. Douglas won the Senate seat. State legislatures chose senators in those days. But Lincoln won something more valuable: a reputation as a brilliant speaker and moral voice against slavery. In 1860, when the Republican Party needed a presidential candidate who could win both the North and the crucial border states, they turned to Abraham Lincoln. As you breathe in the quiet of night, imagine those debates under open skies, thousands of people listening intently for hours, the future of the nation being decided by the power of words and ideas, by citizens willing to engage with difficult questions and make informed choices. As you drift now, imagine the weight of that nomination, the responsibility settling onto the shoulders of a man who had known poverty, loss, and failure, who carried deep sadness within him, who now faced the possibility of leading a nation on the brink of catastrophe. Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860 with less than 40% of the popular vote, in a 4-way race. He didn't receive a single vote in 10 southern states. His name wasn't even on the ballot there. His victory was seen in the South as a threat to their way of life, and within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, 7 southern states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln's first inaugural address was both firm and conciliatory. He said he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, but he also said secession was illegal, and he would enforce federal law. He closed with an eloquent plea for unity. "We are not enemies. But friends, we must not be enemies. But it was too late. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the Civil War began. 4 more states seceded. The Union was broken. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and young men from both North and South rushed to enlist, expecting a quick, glorious war. No one imagined it would last 4 years and cost over 600,000 American lives. Lincoln faced an impossible task. He had to hold together the remaining states, including 4 border states that allowed slavery but had not seceded. He had to build an army from scratch, find capable generals, and wage war against his own countrymen. He had to manage Northern politicians who criticized every decision and wanted to negotiate with the Confederacy. He threw himself into the war effort with an intensity that consumed him. He was in the War Department telegraph office almost daily, reading dispatches from the front, sending orders to generals, tracking troop movements on maps. He read military strategy books, taught himself tactics, studied the art of war. He interviewed generals, questioned their plans, challenged their assumptions. He needed generals who would fight, who would press the attack, who would use the Union's superiority to wear down the Confederacy. But finding such generals proved agonizingly difficult. General Irvin McDowell led Union forces to disaster at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, where Confederate forces routed the Northern Army and sent soldiers and civilians fleeing back to Washington in panic. Lincoln replaced him with George B. McClellan, a brilliant organizer but an overly cautious commander, who always believed he was outnumbered and always found reasons to delay. Lincoln personally visited the army multiple times, riding out to camps, reviewing troops, meeting with officers. Soldiers came to love him. They saw him as one of them, a common man who had risen through hard work, who understood their suffering, who cared about their lives. He read casualty reports every day, and each list of dead and wounded weighed on him. He wrote personal letters to families of fallen soldiers, trying to offer comfort, while knowing that nothing he could say would truly ease their pain. One letter to Mrs. Bixby, who was believed to have lost 5 sons in the war, became famous for its eloquence. "I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming." The war ground on through 1862, with mounting casualties and little progress. Lincoln rarely slept more than a few hours a night. His face grew gaunt, his eyes hollow. He lost weight, and he had to decide what to do about slavery. He personally hated slavery, called it evil, wanted it ended. But he was president of a divided nation, and he knew that if he moved too quickly, he might push the border states into the Confederacy and lose the war entirely. Abolitionists pressured him constantly. Frederick Douglass, the great black leader and orator, criticized Lincoln for moving too slowly. But Lincoln was thinking strategically, waiting for the right moment. Privately, he was already drafting the Emancipation Proclamation. In July 1862, he shared a draft with his cabinet. Secretary of State William Seward argued that issuing the proclamation after a string of military defeats would look like an act of desperation. Lincoln should wait for a Union victory so the proclamation would come from a position of strength. Lincoln agreed. He put the draft in a drawer and waited. He wrote to the editor of the New York Tribune, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. Abolitionists saw this as a betrayal, but Lincoln was being politically careful, preparing the ground for the radical step he was about to take. He needed Northern conservatives to accept emancipation as a war measure, not as an abolitionist crusade. He also dealt with the daily burdens of command. He spent hours meeting with politicians, office seekers, and ordinary citizens who lined up at the White House every day. He called these meetings his public opinion baths, and though they exhausted him, he saw them as essential for staying connected to the people. He pardoned deserters when he could find any excuse to do so. He hated the death penalty for military crimes, believing young men who fled in terror deserved mercy, not execution. His secretary, John Hay, said Lincoln couldn't bear to sign a death warrant and would clutch at any fact that would justify a pardon. His relationship with his cabinet was complex. These were strong-willed, ambitious men, many of whom had sought the presidency themselves. Secretary of State William Seward initially thought he would be the real power behind Lincoln's presidency. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase constantly schemed to replace Lincoln. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was brilliant but abrasive, often rude to Lincoln. Yet Lincoln managed them all with patience and political skill, using their talents while tolerating their egos and ambitions. "I must do it," he would say when overruling them. "I am responsible." As the night deepens around you, imagine the weight of such responsibility, the burden of decisions that would determine whether the nation survived, whether millions would remain enslaved or go free, whether hundreds of thousands would live or die. In February 1862, both Willie and Tad Lincoln fell ill with typhoid fever, probably from contaminated water in the White House. Tad recovered, but 11-year-old Willie died on February 20th, 1862. Lincoln was devastated. He shut himself in a room and sobbed. He visited Willie's resting place repeatedly. Mary was so overcome with grief that she couldn't attend the funeral. For months, she was too distraught to function, and Lincoln worried she might lose her mind entirely. Willie's death came during a particularly difficult period of the war. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign was failing, casualties were mounting, Northern morale was low, and now Lincoln had lost the child he loved most, the boy who reminded him of everything good and hopeful in the world. He wrote to a friend, "My poor boy, he was too good for this earth. God has called him home. I know that he is much better off in heaven. But then, we loved him so." Lincoln would sometimes go alone to the room where Willie's body had lain, locking the door and weeping. Staff members could hear him through the walls. He could barely work for days after the death, sitting at his desk staring at papers without seeing them. The loss of Willie added to the weight Lincoln already carried. The burden of hundreds of thousands of deaths in the war, the knowledge that his decisions sent men to die. Friends noticed a change in him after Willie's death. He became more philosophical, more fatalistic, more likely to speak of God's purposes and divine will. He began to see the war as perhaps serving some larger purpose, some divine plan that transcended human understanding or control. As you breathe slowly now, let yourself rest in the knowledge that we can carry enormous grief and still function. That duty sometimes requires us to set aside our pain. That strength is not the absence of sorrow, but the will to continue despite it. That moment Lincoln had been waiting for came after the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, the single bloodiest day in American military history, with over 23,000 casualties. The Union forces managed to stop Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland, giving Lincoln the victory he had been waiting for. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion against the United States would be, then, thenceforward, and forever free. The proclamation was limited in scope. It didn't apply to border states that had remained loyal. Lincoln issued it under his war powers as Commander-in-Chief, calling it a necessary military measure. But everyone understood its significance. It transformed the war from a conflict about union to a conflict about freedom. On January 1, 1863, after spending hours shaking hands at a New Year's Day reception, Lincoln went upstairs to his office and signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. His hand trembled from fatigue, and he paused before signing, saying, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." His signature was clear and strong. The proclamation didn't free all enslaved people immediately, only those in Confederate territory, which the Union didn't yet control, but it meant that every advance of Union armies now carried freedom with it, and it authorized the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black men had served in uniform, fighting for their own freedom and for the Union. Lincoln met with Frederick Douglass 3 times during the war. The first time any president had met with a black leader as an equal. Douglass came to discuss the treatment of black soldiers, who were paid less than white soldiers and faced execution if captured by Confederates. Lincoln listened, promised to address the pay disparity, and impressed Douglass with his honesty and commitment. Douglass later wrote that Lincoln was the first great man that I talked with in the United States freely, who in no single instance reminded me of the difference between himself and myself, of the difference of color. As the night deepens around you, let yourself feel the courage of that moment. The weight of knowing your decision will change millions of lives. The faith it took to do what Lincoln believed was right, even when the outcome was uncertain. Lincoln himself changed during the war. He grew more gaunt, his face more lined with care. He barely slept. He visited hospitals to comfort wounded soldiers. He aged visibly during his presidency. Photographs from 1861 show a relatively smooth-faced man of 52. By 1865, he looked 20 years older. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles, his face deeply lined. He joked about his appearance, saying he was the ugliest man in America, and that God must love ugly people because he made so many of them. He rarely took time for relaxation. He would go to the theater occasionally. It was one of the few places he could forget his burdens for a few hours. He loved Shakespeare and knew many plays by heart, especially the tragedies, Macbeth, Hamlet, King Lear, with their themes of power, ambition, and the consequences of moral choices. He also continued telling stories and jokes, even in the darkest times. He once said, "I laugh because I must not cry." The stories were his way of coping, of maintaining sanity in an insane situation. He also struggled to find competent generals. McClellan was too cautious. Ambrose Burnside led troops to slaughter at Fredericksburg, Joseph Hooker was outmaneuvered at Chancellorsville. Finally, in 1864, Lincoln found his general in Ulysses S. Grant, a rumpled, determined fighter who understood that the war had to be won through relentless pressure. Grant and his colleague William Tecumseh Sherman waged total war against the South, destroying not just armies, but the economic infrastructure that supported them. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a cemetery for the soldiers who had fallen there 4 months earlier in the war's bloodiest battle. He was not the main speaker. That honor went to the famous orator Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for just 2 minutes. The day was cold and overcast. A crowd of perhaps 15,000 people had gathered. After Everett finished his 2 hours of eloquent classical oratory, Lincoln stood, wearing his characteristic black suit and stovepipe hat, and spoke in his high, clear voice. He began, 467 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In 272 words, he redefined the war, giving it a meaning that transcended politics and touched on the deepest American ideals. He said the war was testing whether any nation founded on freedom could survive, and he called for a new birth of freedom that would honor the dead by ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. When he sat down, the applause was muted. Many in the crowd hadn't realized he was finished. Lincoln himself thought the speech was a failure. He told the ceremony's organizer, "That speech won't scour," using a farming term meaning it wouldn't polish up well. But he was wrong. Edward Everett wrote to him the next day, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours, as you did, in 2 minutes." The address was revolutionary in subtle ways. Lincoln dated American founding not from the Constitution of 1787, but from the Declaration of Independence of 1776, with its assertion that all men are created equal. He was redefining the war's purpose, saying it was about making that promise real. This was radical, but Lincoln planted the seed of an idea that would grow over generations. As you breathe in the stillness of the night, imagine standing on that battlefield, the graves of thousands surrounding you, a tall, gaunt man speaking words that would echo through history, words that would come to define what America aspired to be. In 1864, Lincoln ran for re-election against George McClellan, the general he had fired for being too cautious. For most of that summer, Lincoln believed he would lose. The war dragged on with no end in sight. Casualties mounted. Northern newspapers called for peace negotiations. Lincoln wrote a private memorandum saying that if he lost, he would cooperate with the new president-elect to save the Union, because he would have been elected on a platform that couldn't possibly do so. But then Sherman captured Atlanta in September, giving the Union a crucial victory. The war's momentum shifted. On November 8, 1864, Lincoln won re-election with 55% of the popular vote and a landslide in the Electoral College. His second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, was only 701 words long, but is considered one of the greatest presidential speeches ever given. The war was nearly over. Victory was certain. Many expected Lincoln to be triumphant, to condemn the South, to celebrate the North's righteousness. The day was cold and wet, with rain turning to sunshine just as Lincoln began to speak. A crowd of perhaps 50,000 people had gathered at the Capitol. Frederick Douglass stood in the crowd. As Lincoln appeared on the platform, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds and illuminated him, a moment many saw as symbolic. Instead of triumph, Lincoln was humble and gracious. He said both North and South prayed to the same God, read the same Bible, and yet had gone to war. He suggested the war was perhaps God's judgment on both sides for the sin of slavery, and he closed with words that defined his vision for the peace to come. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over. The Union was preserved. Over 600,000 Americans had died, but the nation would remain united. Lincoln was exhausted, but relieved. He spoke of Reconstruction, of bringing the Southern states back into the Union with generosity rather than vengeance. He wanted to move forward, to heal the wounds, to ensure the war's sacrifices had not been in vain. He was only 56 years old. He had 4 more years as president. There was so much work still to do. When Lee surrendered, the terms Grant offered were generous, reflecting Lincoln's wishes. Confederate soldiers would not be prosecuted for treason. They could keep their horses for spring planting. Officers could keep their sidearms. They would be paroled and sent home. "The war is over," Grant said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." On April 11th, Lincoln gave a speech from a White House window about Reconstruction. He argued that Louisiana should be readmitted to the Union. He also suggested, for the first time publicly, that some black men, those who had served in the military or were educated, should be given the vote. This was radical for 1865, and it enraged Confederate sympathizers who heard it, including a young actor named John Wilkes Booth, who stood in the crowd that night and said, "That is the last speech he will ever make." Lincoln had always known assassination was possible. He received death threats regularly. He rarely took precautions. His friend Ward Hill Lamon begged him to be more careful, but Lincoln shrugged off the warnings. "If they want to kill me," he said, "there is nothing I can do to prevent it." On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln and Mary went to Ford's Theater in Washington to see a comedy called Our American Cousin. Lincoln almost didn't go. He was tired and had work to do. But Mary wanted to get out, to celebrate the war's end. When the audience saw Lincoln enter his private box above the stage, they stood and cheered. Lincoln smiled and bowed, then sat in a rocking chair, Mary beside him, to watch the play. Behind the scenes, John Wilkes Booth was preparing to commit murder. Booth was 26 years old, from a distinguished theatrical family, handsome and charismatic. He was also a Confederate sympathizer who saw Lincoln as a tyrant, who blamed him for the South's defeat, who believed that killing him might somehow reverse the Confederacy's fortunes. Booth knew Ford's Theater well. He had performed there many times. He knew the layout, knew the staff, knew Lincoln would be there that night. Around 10:15 p.m., during the play's funniest scene, when the audience was laughing loudly, Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a small Derringer pistol. Mary screamed. Booth jumped from the box to the stage, breaking his leg in the fall, and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, before limping out the back door and escaping on horseback. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he was laid diagonally across a bed too short for his tall frame. Mary sat beside him, weeping. Cabinet members and friends gathered through the night. Doctors did what little they could, but the wound was mortal. Booth had also directed co-conspirators to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward that same night. Seward was severely wounded, but both men survived. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing beside the bed, said quietly, "Now he belongs to the ages." As the world around you fades, let yourself rest in the poignancy of that moment. A great man taken at the height of his triumph. A life cut short just as his work was reaching fulfillment. A tragedy that completed the martyrdom and ensured his place in history. The nation was stunned. Churches held services on Easter Sunday just one day after the assassination, with pastors comparing Lincoln to Christ, both murdered on Good Friday, both dying for others' sins. Millions lined the railroad tracks as Lincoln's funeral train carried his body from Washington to Springfield, a 1,700-mile journey through mourning towns and cities. Flags were lowered to half-mast, businesses closed, people gathered in streets and churches, weeping for a man most had never met, but who had come to symbolize the Union's cause and the promise of freedom. Booth was hunted down by federal troops and killed in a barn in Virginia on April 26, 1865. Less than 2 weeks after the assassination, his co-conspirators were captured, tried, and hanged. But Booth achieved his goal in a way he never intended. He made Lincoln a martyr, ensured his place in history, transformed him from a controversial president into a symbol of freedom and union. Lincoln's body lay in state in the East Room of the White House, where over 25,000 people filed past to pay their respects. Then it lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where another 25,000 came. Then began the extraordinary journey back to Springfield, stopping in major cities: Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, where enormous crowds gathered. In every city, Lincoln's coffin was carried to a public building where people could file past. In New York, over 500,000 people viewed the body. The procession moved slowly, taking 2 weeks, as if the nation couldn't bear to let him go. At night, bonfires lit the route, and people stood in darkness watching the train pass, many weeping. On May 4, 1865, Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, alongside the reinterred body of his son Willie. 3 of his 4 sons would eventually be buried there with him, as would Mary, when her time came. Lincoln's legacy grew over the decades. He saved the Union. He ended slavery, though the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States, wasn't ratified until December 1865, 8 months after his death. He articulated ideals of freedom and equality that continue to inspire people around the world. From Nelson Mandela to Martin Luther King Jr., from Gandhi to countless others. Lincoln's vision of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal has inspired movements for justice worldwide. He was not perfect. He made mistakes. His views on race, while progressive for his time, would be considered paternalistic today. He suspended habeas corpus during the war, allowing arbitrary arrests. He could be politically ruthless when necessary. He struggled with depression and was sometimes paralyzed by indecision. He supported colonization schemes that would send freed slaves to Africa or Central America, a position he later abandoned. In debates with Stephen Douglas, he said he did not favor social and political equality between whites and blacks, words that sting today, however calculated they were for his era. But he grew. By 1865, he was advocating for limited black suffrage. He had come to respect black soldiers who fought for the Union, saying they had earned citizenship through their service. He was moving, slowly and pragmatically, toward a more expansive vision of equality. We cannot know where he would have gone had he lived, but the trajectory was toward greater inclusion, greater justice. But he also showed what one person can do. Even someone born in poverty with no advantages, even someone who knew profound sadness and loss, even someone who failed repeatedly and doubted himself constantly. He taught himself, improved himself, and rose through intelligence, honesty, and determination. He led with both strength and compassion. He preserved a nation and freed millions. His early failures and obscurity make his ultimate triumph even more remarkable. He lost jobs, failed in business, was rejected in love, lost elections. He suffered from chronic depression. He was awkward, ungainly, odd-looking, from the backwoods with no social graces. Yet he became the most eloquent president America has produced, the one whose words are quoted more than any other, the one whose moral vision transformed the nation. His words continue to echo through American history. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. With malice toward none, with charity for all. These are not just phrases, but principles, ideals that challenge every generation to live up to the promise of equality and freedom. The Lincoln Memorial, dedicated in 1922, has become a sacred space in American civic religion. It stands at one end of the National Mall in Washington, a Greek temple housing a massive statue of a seated Lincoln. The walls are inscribed with his words from the Gettysburg Address and Second Inaugural. It is where Marian Anderson sang in 1939 when barred from other venues because of her race. It is where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech in 1963, consciously echoing Lincoln's language and ideals. Visitors to the memorial often weep. They stand before that great statue, looking up at Lincoln's careworn face, and feel the weight of history, the sacrifice he made, the vision he articulated. It has become a place where America comes to remember its better angels, to recommit to the unfinished work Lincoln described. Historians consistently rank Lincoln as America's greatest president, not because he was perfect, but because he faced the nation's greatest crisis and preserved it, because he ended slavery, the nation's greatest sin, because he articulated ideals of equality and democracy that still guide us, because he showed that leadership requires both moral vision and political skill, both principle and pragmatism. His life offers lessons that transcend politics. His self-education shows that learning is possible for anyone with determination. His honesty demonstrates that integrity builds trust and opens doors. His humor teaches that laughter can sustain us through dark times. His melancholy reminds us that sadness and greatness can coexist, that we need not be free from pain to accomplish meaningful work. But perhaps his greatest legacy is the example he set of moral leadership during crisis. He held to principles while remaining pragmatic. He was willing to move slowly when necessary, but acted decisively when the moment came. He believed in democracy even when it frustrated him, in the Union even when it fractured, in the possibility of equality even when it seemed impossibly distant. As you drift now, let yourself rest in the knowledge that one life can matter, that integrity and perseverance count for something, that even in darkness we can choose to do what is right, that the work of justice and freedom is never finished, but always worth continuing. And so, as you rest tonight, remember that history isn't just written in books. It lives quietly in the choices we make, in the stands we take, in the way we treat others, in the courage we show when faced with injustice. Abraham Lincoln was a man who knew sorrow intimately, but never let it make him cruel. He knew failure, but never let it stop him from trying. He knew hatred, but responded with mercy. He knew division, but worked for union. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, you carry a little of that spirit with you. You are part of a long tradition of people who believe in something larger than themselves, who work for justice even when it's difficult, who hold to hope even in dark times. Lincoln's story reminds us that greatness doesn't require perfect circumstances or special advantages. It requires only the willingness to learn, to grow, to do what is right as best we can see it, and to keep faith with the ideals we hold dear. Sleep well, dream gently, and let the night carry you softly into rest, held by the knowledge that you too have a role to play in the continuing story of freedom and justice, that every generation faces its own tests, its own challenges, its own opportunities to bend history toward righteousness, and that the work Lincoln began, the work of creating a more perfect union, continues in the hearts and actions of all who believe that all people are created equal, that freedom matters, and that government of by and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Good night.